There is a moment that millions of people over 65 know with uncomfortable familiarity. The room is dark, the house is quiet, everything external is exactly as it should be for sleep. And yet something pulls you out of it, not dramatically, not with pain or urgency, but with a quiet and persistent insistence that your eyes open, that your mind activates, that sleep recedes like a tide going out. You look at the clock, it says 2:47 or 3:15 or 3:52. It is always somewhere in that window. And you lie there, awake in the dark, waiting for sleep to return, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for an hour or more, sometimes until it simply does not come back at all. Most people who experience this pattern have been told or have assumed that the explanation is their bladder. And sometimes they do need to use the bathroom during this window, which seems to confirm the explanation. But here is what the research consistently shows. The bladder is almost never the primary cause of the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening in adults over 65. The bladder is, in most cases, a passenger that gets off at the same stop as the real driver. And the real driver is something entirely different, something happening not in the urinary system, but in the liver, the adrenal glands, the circadian clock, and the ancient stress response system of the nervous system that most modern wellness conversations have completely overlooked in this context. I have spent years studying the science of sleep, chronobiology, and metabolic health in aging adults, and the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening is one of the patterns I find most consistently misunderstood and most consistently addressable once the actual mechanism is correctly identified. The reason it persists for years in so many people is not that it is intractable. It is that the interventions most commonly tried, reducing fluid intake, avoiding caffeine, establishing sleep hygiene routines, are aimed at the wrong target. They address the bladder theory of the problem. They do not address what the research identifies as the primary biology driving it. Today, I am going to give you that biology in full. We are going to cover 4 areas of understanding. First, what is actually happening physiologically in the 2 to 4 a.m. window that makes it such a consistent time for awakening across cultures, age groups, and individual circumstances. Second, the 3 primary biological mechanisms that cause this specific window to become a reliable point of sleep disruption in adults over 65, with the research that maps each one. Third, 3 specific, evidence-based nutritional and lifestyle strategies that address these mechanisms directly, with the timing, dosing, and practical application that the research supports. And fourth, why the liver, an organ almost nobody thinks about in the context of sleep, is the most important and most neglected piece of this entire conversation. To understand why the 2 to 4 a.m. window is so specifically and reliably associated with awakening, you first need to understand something about the architecture of the night that most people have never been told, because it reframes the entire experience from mysterious and random to biologically predictable and meaningful. The night is not a uniform state of sleep. It is organized by the circadian system with remarkable precision, each governed by specific hormonal and metabolic processes that occur at specific times. It is organized by the circadian system with remarkable precision, each governed by specific hormonal and metabolic processes that occur at specific times. The first half of the night, roughly 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. in a person with a conventional sleep schedule, is dominated by slow-wave sleep, the deepest and most physically restorative stage during which human growth hormone is secreted. Cellular repair is prioritized and the immune system conducts much of its maintenance activity. The second half of the night, from approximately 2 a.m. to 6 or 7 a.m., shifts toward REM sleep dominance, the stage associated with emotional memory processing, neural consolidation, and dreaming. The transition between these 2 phases, the shift from slow-wave sleep dominance to REM dominance that occurs in the 2 to 4 a.m. window, is a period of biological reorganization during which sleep is naturally lighter than it is in the depths of either phase. In young, healthy adults, this transition is seamless and largely imperceptible. The sleeping brain moves from one phase to the other without surfacing to consciousness because the neurological threshold for awakening remains high enough to absorb the mild arousal signals that accompany the transition. The sleeping brain moves from one phase to the other without surfacing to consciousness because the neurological threshold for awakening remains high enough to absorb the mild arousal signals that accompany the transition. In adults over 65, this threshold has diminished significantly for the reasons we have discussed in previous conversations, and the mild arousal that accompanies the phase transition is frequently enough to bring the brain fully to wakefulness. This is the baseline vulnerability. The 2 to 4 a.m. window is a naturally lighter moment in every human night. What turns it from an occasional light moment into a reliable awakening in older adults is the convergence of specific biological processes that generate their own arousal signals precisely in this window, compounding the natural phase transition vulnerability into something much more disruptive. The first of these processes is a cortisol phenomenon that most people have never heard discussed in connection with sleep. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone produced by the adrenal glands, follows a precise circadian rhythm. It reaches its daily nadir, its lowest point, at approximately midnight, and then begins rising in a surge called the cortisol awakening response that peaks around 6 to 8 a.m. This morning surge is not incidental. It is a deliberate biological mechanism designed to prepare the body for the demands of the waking day, mobilizing glucose, activating the immune system, raising blood pressure, and promoting alertness. In young adults with well-regulated circadian rhythms, this surge begins its ascent gradually and does not generate arousal signals until the appropriate waking time. In adults over 65 with disrupted circadian function, blunted melatonin production, or elevated chronic stress burden, initiating its ascent as early as 2 or 3 a.m. rather than 4 or 5 a.m., and generating the arousal, glucose mobilization, and sympathetic nervous system activation that are designed for morning at a time when the body should still be in its deepest overnight recovery. Research published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology measuring cortisol secretion profiles across age groups found that adults over 65 with self-reported sleep maintenance insomnia showed a cortisol nadir that was not only higher in absolute terms than age-matched good sleepers, reflecting chronic stress burden, but also shifted earlier in the night, with the ascending phase of the cortisol curve beginning 1 to 2 hours earlier than in good sleepers. The early cortisol surge was the strongest predictor of the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening pattern in that study, stronger than any measure of sleep apnea, bladder urgency, or pain. The second process is hepatic glycogen depletion and the reactive blood sugar response that follows it. The liver stores glucose as glycogen and releases it gradually into the bloodstream during the overnight fast to maintain stable blood sugar levels while the digestive system is inactive. This hepatic glucose release is one of the most critical overnight physiological functions because the brain, which cannot store glucose itself, depends entirely on this continuous hepatic supply to maintain the stable blood sugar environment that deep sleep requires. By the 2 to 4 a.m. window, typically 6 to 8 hours after the last meal, the liver's glycogen reserves have been substantially depleted, and its capacity to maintain stable blood glucose release is diminishing. In a metabolically healthy younger adult, the transition from glycogen-derived glucose to fat-derived glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis is smooth and minimally disruptive to sleep. In adults over 65, several factors converge to make this transition significantly rougher. Insulin resistance reduces the efficiency of glucose regulation. Reduced hepatic glycogen storage capacity means the depletion threshold is reached earlier in the night, and the enzymatic machinery for overnight gluconeogenesis operates more slowly and less efficiently in the aging liver. The result is a transient blood sugar dip in the 2 to 4 a.m. window that triggers counter-regulatory hormone release, specifically cortisol and glucagon, both of which are arousal-promoting, and both of which generate the kind of physiological activation that the brain's lighter sleep state in this window cannot ignore. Research published in Diabetes Care confirmed that even subclinical nocturnal hypoglycemia, blood sugar dips that do not meet the diagnostic threshold for clinical hypoglycemia, produce reliable awakening in adults over 60 through this counter-regulatory mechanism. The awakening feels inexplicable to the person experiencing it because they have no conscious awareness of blood sugar, but the biology is operating with complete consistency. The third process involves the liver's relationship with Chinese medicine's clock concept, which modern chronobiology has provided a compelling scientific framework for understanding. Traditional Chinese medicine has for centuries associated the 2 to 4 a.m. window with liver function describing this as the time when liver energy is highest and when the organ is most actively engaged in its detoxification and processing work. Modern chronobiology has validated the core observation, if not the energetic framework, and that peak hepatic metabolic activity, including the processing of metabolic byproducts, the conjugation and elimination of hormones, and the regulation of lipid metabolism, or the processing burden of medications or alcohol consumed during the day, that can be sufficient to disturb sleep in the vulnerable 2 to 4 a.m. window. When the liver is under metabolic stress, whether from accumulated toxins, excess processed fats, glycogen management challenges, or the processing burden of medications or alcohol consumed during the day, its peak nighttime activity generates a level of metabolic heat, sympathetic activation, and neural signaling through the vagus nerve that can be sufficient to disturb sleep in the vulnerable 2 to 4 a.m. window. A study published in the Journal of Hepatology examining sleep quality in adults with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, a condition affecting approximately 40% of adults over 60 to some degree, found that the severity of liver metabolic dysfunction was one of the strongest predictors of awakening frequency, mediated through increased vagal signaling and elevated nighttime cortisol associated with hepatic metabolic stress. Mediated through increased vagal signaling and elevated nighttime cortisol associated with hepatic metabolic stress. The evening meal plays a more significant role in overnight blood sugar stability than most people realize because it establishes the glycogen loading of the liver that will need to sustain blood glucose through 8 or more hours of fasting. A dinner that is very low in complex carbohydrates, a pattern that has become common among health-conscious older adults following low-carbohydrate dietary advice, may leave the liver with insufficient glycogen to maintain stable blood glucose through the full overnight fast, increasing the likelihood of the depletion and reactive counter-regulatory response in the 2 to 4 a.m. window. And crucially, all three have specific, evidence-based nutritional and lifestyle responses that can meaningfully reduce their sleep-disrupting effects. The most direct and most immediately impactful intervention for the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening addresses the hepatic glycogen depletion mechanism. The evening meal plays a more significant role in overnight blood sugar stability than most people realize because it establishes the glycogen loading of the liver. The evening meal plays a more significant role in overnight blood sugar stability than most people realize because it establishes the glycogen loading of the liver that will need to sustain blood glucose through 8 or more hours of fasting. A dinner that is very low in complex carbohydrates may leave the liver with insufficient glycogen to maintain stable blood glucose through the full overnight fast. Research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that older adults who consumed a dinner with a moderate complex carbohydrate component showed significantly more stable nocturnal blood glucose profiles. The slowly digestible carbohydrates provided a more sustained hepatic glycogen replenishment that extended the liver's capacity. The specific carbohydrates that perform best in this context are those with the lowest glycemic index combined with the highest resistant starch content. Legumes including lentils, chickpeas, and black beans provide resistant starch alongside plant protein and magnesium, both of which support the overnight hormonal environment. Oats consumed as part of an evening meal provide beta-glucan, a soluble fiber that slows gastric emptying. This is the intervention most likely to produce the fastest subjective improvement in the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening pattern. And it is also the one most consistently dismissed by people who have been told that eating close to bedtime is unhealthy. The reason it persists for years in so many people is not that it is intractable, it is aimed at the wrong target. The blanket advice against eating before bed is based on the legitimate concern about late-night caloric excess. It was never intended to eliminate a targeted, small, metabolically strategic snack. The most effective pre-sleep snack for this purpose combines a small amount of complex carbohydrate with a protein source and a small amount of fat. The most effective pre-sleep snack for this purpose combines a small amount of complex carbohydrate with protein and fat. The carbohydrate extends hepatic glycogen availability. The protein supports gluconeogenesis. The fat slows digestion. Research from the University of Florida found a 41% reduction in 2 to 4 a.m. awakening frequency over 4 weeks. Practical combinations include a small bowl of oatmeal made with a tablespoon of almond butter and a few berries, a slice of whole grain toast with cottage cheese and a drizzle of olive oil, a small handful of walnuts with a few dates and a teaspoon of nut butter, half an avocado. The timing matters. Consuming this snack 30 to 45 minutes before bed allows the initial digestive processing to begin before sleep onset. Normalization of the circadian timing of cortisol secretion, not merely to reduce total cortisol output. Too early, and the glucose supply curve peaks before the critical overnight window. Timing matters. The first pathway involves the adaptogenic compound ashwagandha, whose relevance here is through timing support. Research published in the journal Medicine found that ashwagandha root extract produced a measurable normalization. This timing shift is specifically relevant because it moves the arousal signal to the more appropriate morning window. The clinical dose used in the sleep-specific research is 300 to 600 milligrams of a standardized extract taken in the evening. The second pathway for cortisol timing normalization involves light exposure management, specifically the relationship between evening light exposure and the melatonin-cortisol interaction. Melatonin and cortisol have an inverse relationship in their circadian rhythms. As melatonin rises, cortisol falls. When melatonin secretion is blunted or delayed by evening light exposure, el ciclo hormonal se interrumpe. Research from Harvard Medical School found that evening blue light exposure delayed the onset of the cortisol nadir. Adults over 65 showed significantly greater sensitivity to this effect due to lens changes. Eliminating screens entirely for 90 minutes before bed produces the greatest benefit. Using blue light filtering glasses reduces the disruption. And brief morning light exposure anchors the circadian clock in the morning, which automatically stabilizes cycles. This approach normalizes when in the night the body's arousal chemistry activates. Consistency is key. The third strategy is the one most genuinely surprising to most people, directly supporting liver health and reducing hepatic metabolic burden. The liver performs over 500 distinct metabolic functions, clearing the accumulated metabolic waste of the day. When the liver is metabolically stressed by accumulated fats, alcohol, or medications, its peak activity generates heat. The first nutritional compound with specific liver support properties is milk thistle, or silymarin. Research found that silymarin supplementation produced significant reductions in liver stress markers. The dose used in research showing sleep-relevant benefits is 140 to 420 milligrams of standardized silymarin daily, taken with meals. Evening dosing is particularly strategic. Choline is required for the production of VLDL, the particle the liver uses to export fat into circulation. When choline is insufficient, fat accumulates in the liver, a condition affecting 40% of adults over 60. Increasing dietary choline intake reduced liver fat content and significantly improved sleep continuity. Foods richest in choline include eggs, beef liver, and salmon alongside cruciferous vegetables. Salmon provides omega-3 fatty acids that reduce hepatic inflammation, supported by cruciferous vegetables. The third liver-supportive compound relevant to nighttime sleep is glycine, a primary substrate for the synthesis of glutathione. Glycine is a primary substrate for the synthesis of glutathione, supporting both neural and hepatic environments. A warm cup of bone broth served 45 minutes before bed facilitates the shift toward relaxation. Research found that glycine from bone broth sources produced sleep quality improvements equivalent to supplementation. The 2 to 4 a.m. awakening has a particular psychological quality that distinguishes it from other forms of sleep disruption. The sense of isolation in a dark house at that hour is qualitatively different from daytime solitude. The mind in that window tends toward a heavier wakefulness. Worries at 3 in the morning feel larger. Stripped of engagement, daytime busyness provides. Isolation in a dark and quiet house is qualitatively different, and the knowledge that the alarm will ring at 6 or 7 adds its own layer of pressure. This is not coincidental. The cortisol that is prematurely surging is specifically the hormone of threat assessment and stress response. It is doing in the brain what it is designed to do, scanning for problems, mobilizing resources, preparing for challenges. The biology and the psychology of the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening are not separate phenomena. The hormonal disruption creates the psychological texture. A 73-year-old retired engineer described this experience with a precision that I think captures something important. He had been waking reliably at 3:15 for over 2 years. He had been through every standard intervention: sleep restriction therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, melatonin at various doses. He described lying awake in that window as the loneliest experience of his week: physical and emotional exhaustion. What eventually shifted his pattern was the combination of interventions we have discussed today, approached in a specific sequence. He began with the pre-sleep snack. Half an avocado on a piece of whole grain toast produced the fastest feedback. Within 10 days, he reported that the awakening had shifted to 4:30 or 4:45. Meaningful progress. He added ashwagandha and was sleeping through until 5:30 or 6 on most nights. He trusted his nights again. He described the experience not just as sleeping better, but as trusting his nights again, as being able to go to bed without anticipatory dread. The feedback loop between sleep disruption and sleep anxiety is one of the most important dimensions of the 2 to 4 a.m. pattern. Anticipatory anxiety is itself a cortisol trigger. The body initiates the stress response slightly before. Improving the biology through the nutritional and lifestyle strategies we have discussed creates the conditions in which the anticipation can gradually dissolve. Participants who received combined metabolic and behavioral interventions showed significantly greater improvements. There is also a relationship dimension to the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening that is rarely discussed but is genuinely important for many couples. The biology of sleep in a shared bed is relational. Addressed sleep is an act of care for both. Partners of adults with sleep maintenance insomnia showed measurably reduced slow-wave sleep. The biology of sleep in a shared bed is relational in a way that makes addressing one partner's disrupted sleep an act of care for both. Here is the truth that the research consistently converges on, stated without qualification: you are not waking up because you need to use the bathroom. Producing reliable arousal in the most neurologically vulnerable window, the bladder goes along for the ride. Premature cortisol surge from a dysregulated circadian HPA axis produces reliable arousal in this window. Pre-sleep snack designed to extend hepatic glycogen availability and prevent reactive hypoglycemia, specifically to normalize the timing of the circadian cortisol curve so that the ascending phase begins later, moving the arousal signal out of the 2 to 4 a.m. window where it has no business being. Liver support through silymarin, adequate dietary choline, and pre-sleep glycine from bone broth or supplemental sources. Reducing the metabolic burden and oxidative stress that make peak hepatic nighttime activity a source of activation. Rather than quiet background biological maintenance, silence of the body, the 2 to 4 a.m. window stops being a reliable appointment and begins being simply a part of the night you sleep through. The way you once did and the way your biology, properly supported, is entirely capable of doing again. Consume it 45 minutes before bed and notice what happens to the timing and frequency of your awakening. If you add ashwagandha in week 2 and a cup of bone broth in week 3, you will have implemented all 3 interventions. The improvements that emerge are durable in a way that acute interventions rarely produce. Consistent progress. Every comment contributes to a community that is collectively learning to care for the biology of aging with more precision and hope. Understanding the actual mechanism is what makes the actual interventions possible. A pre-sleep snack of complex carbohydrate, moderate protein, and small amounts of healthy fat. 3 mechanisms, 3 specific interventions. 1 consistent outcome when they are applied with adequate consistency and patience. The liver did not fail you. The circadian clock did not abandon you. The blood sugar regulation system did not permanently break. They shifted in ways that the biology of aging makes predictable and that the right nutritional and lifestyle inputs can meaningfully address. The body at 65 or 70 or 75 retains the capacity to sleep through the night. It needs the conditions to do so to be restored. It is never too late to give the night back to yourself. I want to close with a thought about what the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening costs beyond sleep itself. It shapes your sense of yourself as someone who is aging with vitality rather than simply aging. The night becomes something to manage and endure rather than surrender to. Time feels heavy. The tiredness that accumulates from years of fragmented nights shapes your energy and resilience. It shapes your sense of yourself as someone who is aging with vitality rather than simply aging. Start tonight with the simplest intervention, the pre-sleep snack, a small piece of whole grain toast. Consume it 45 minutes before bed and notice what happens over the following 2 weeks. Do not expect overnight transformation. Expect gradual, consistent improvement night by night. If you add ashwagandha in week 2 and a cup of bone broth in week 3, you will have implemented the protocol. With each given enough time to begin establishing its effect before the next is added. Patience is required. Give the full protocol 12 weeks before making your final assessment of its impact. The research is consistent. Circadian timing normalization takes longer than expected, but it is durable. But the improvements that emerge are durable in a way that acute interventions rarely produce. If this conversation identified the mechanism behind your experience, I would genuinely like to hear about it. How long has the 2 to 4 a.m. awakening been part of your nights? What have you tried? Every comment contributes to a community that is collectively learning to care for the biology of aging. Share this video with someone in your life who has been lying awake in the dark in the early hours. The result is a transient blood sugar dip in the 2 to 4 a.m. window that triggers counter-regulatory hormone release, specifically cortisol and glucagon, both of which are arousal-promoting. Blood sugar dips that do not meet the diagnostic threshold for clinical hypoglycemia. Traditional Chinese medicine has for centuries associated the 2 to 4 a.m. window with liver function. I will see you in the next one. Take care of your sleep.